Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Jake Sotiriadis, a global futurist and strategic foresight expert, as we unpack some of the most pressing challenges leaders face today. In our conversation, we're going to explain why traditional risk management is no longer enough and how strategic foresight provides a more dynamic approach to addressing uncertainty. Also, Jake will introduce a transformative mental toolkit designed to help leaders tackle challenges with clarity and precision. So, if you're ready to rethink leadership and equip yourself with the tools to navigate today's complexity, this episode is packed with insights that you can't afford to miss. Enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. What got you really interested in this work and some parts of your background that made a difference?
Well, to be honest, what got me into this work was seeing so many examples of where vision just wasn't there, where leaders were in positions to make a change, to make a difference, and didn't take that opportunity. And so, strategic foresight for me really is an opportunity to expand the way that we think. And so, having seen in national security, having served in the Air Force for 21 years, being in the American intelligence community, you see that the failure to take advantage of opportunity in those kinds of jobs and situations is hugely problematic. So that's really where my interest came from, to really dig into this, study it, read about it, and then practice it to where now I'm able to share that with corporate clients.
I love that. And we've entered into an era of overlapping challenges, from geopolitical conflicts to technological disruptions that really demand more than business as usual thinking. Why do leaders today need to prepare for what you call a polycrisis, and how can they equip their teams to handle the unexpected?
Well, it's a great question. And I think it comes down to the fact that the world we live in today, Charles, is so much more interconnected than it's ever been at any period in history. And that just doesn't, that's not some phrase that's theoretical. I mean, it's very, very real. I mean, if you think back to just May of 2023, there was an incident that happened where somebody uploaded an image of an explosion outside of the Pentagon. That's what they labeled the image as. It ended up being just a false image that was created by AI that somebody uploaded. But what happened was once the financial markets in New York opened in the morning, that image in and of itself created a panic and we saw an actual drop in the markets. So in that instance, misinformation, disinformation, technology, the economy and national security all came together. That's that interconnected piece that I'm talking about. And imagine if that were an actual adversary doing that, that was a dedicated adversary, not just maybe some hacker. So leaders have to understand how all of these areas, how the economy is interconnected to national security, to technology, to innovation, to all of these sectors. They have to understand how to make sense of all this and make better decisions against the backdrop of this complexity that we're living in.
And you have different frameworks for modern leadership, and you talk about a cognitive operating system. Why should every leader care to have one, or how do they update their cognitive operating system to deal with such environments like we're in right now?
Let me just say that I know that that term sounds maybe a little bit technical or clunky, right? Cognitive operating system. What I'm really trying to do with that is just give an analogy, and I think most of us can relate to this. On our laptops or our desktops, right? There's an operating system that's the interface between the user and the hardware, right? That then the hardware, which is the actual desktop or laptop, and then the software. It brings it all together. And so, what I'm just arguing for is that we need to have the same kind of capacity in an age of artificial intelligence where we can bring it all together, where we're able to truly make this a human machine teaming effort, where we're not going to lose the creativity that we bring as human beings and as leaders, but we're going to augment and we're going to enhance that creativity by partnering with machine based solutions. So it's a really fascinating time, I think, to be alive. And this is something that we need to tap into. Where I used the term in more of a decision making framework was that we have to basically understand that this this cognitive operating system rests on these pillars of embracing complexity, understanding what complexity means, challenging the status quo, which is very, very, very important. And then understanding that we have to look at things from an anticipatory mindset. We have to develop an anticipatory mindset to not just be reactive to items, but to actually be proactive.
What role do you think that emotional intelligence plays in this cognitive operating system, or does it?
I think it plays a huge role, and this is one of the items that it's so hard to quantify. It's so hard to pinpoint, for example, what that actually means, where it fits in. But I think this is where we talk about things like soft skills, right, in leadership. And you know, I feel like sometimes that term does what that evokes actually a disservice, because really what we're talking about is understanding how human beings function, what makes them tick, understanding what motivates them, what discourages them, what encourages them. And today, when we're living in this era of true innovation, of bringing not only human capabilities together, but machine-based learning together, that I think even raises the premium for emotional intelligence as a core skill set of leaders to be able to truly understand their workforce, and more importantly, to look into the future to make decisions about those workforces and the future requirements that they need to be aware of.
Absolutely. And today we're on the cusp of a transformative shift with the advent of generative AI tools. And AI can process mountains of data, but context and empathy remain uniquely human strengths. How do we strike this balance so that leaders can use AI without losing that human touch to what they're doing and the results they're producing?
Well, that is, I think, the question of our time. To be honest, I think that could be the basis of the rest of our discussion. But what I'll take from it, just at least is one short overview into that, is we have to make we have to make sure that we understand that there is no replacement for the innovative and imaginative capacity of the human mind. And sometimes people say, well, what happens when we reach the point of general artificial intelligence? What happens when we reach that singularity moment? I think before we even get there, we need to go back and actually rediscover some of the fundamental philosophical foundations of our society. We need to go back again and read Plato and Aristotle. We need to understand that these philosophical underpinnings that try to help us understand how the world hangs together are very, very important and meaningful. Recognize that we got here, we arrived at this point in human history, built on those foundations. So we don't necessarily just sort of cast all of that aside and begin to now ask AI tools what we ought to do. I think if we're looking at artificial intelligence as a means to enhance what we're doing, to enhance to really to truly be a partner in our endeavors, though that's where we're going to see optimal results. When we start using these tools as sort of this idea of a replacement or a sort of a crutch, if you will, or frankly, because some people just want to rely on that and maybe be intellectually lazy. I think that's not going to be a strategy for winning the competition in the future.
Can agree with you more because leaders should treat AI as a collaborative partner rather than a replacement. And you mentioned relying on automation alone overlooks a critical aspect of sense making, defined as our need for contextualized knowledge. And right now, our ability to understand the story comes from a deep knowledge of cultural, historical, geopolitical, and human factors that algorithms cannot yet fully grasp, correct? I mean, context does matter.
Well, actually, I think context is everything, Charles. And I think we downplay this fact all too often. Some people say that sense making is connecting the dots. I would go a step further. It's not just connecting the dots anymore, it's actually making sense and telling us the story of what those dots mean. And that's something that's really, really difficult to do. So I think this is the value proposition of actually having a human machine teaming framework better developed, because and we can talk about this further along in our conversation, but this is where some of the gen I based tools can help us identify patterns or anomalies by examining a larger swath of data than we could as individuals or even as groups. But at the same time, we have to understand that we, as human beings and as maybe even subject matter experts in particular areas, bring a uniquely contextualized worldview to a situation. And you cannot ask an algorithm, at least at this point in history, to do that. We can't ask an algorithm to tell us, we can't train an LLM to understand how an event that happens in the United States gets interpreted in a different country or a different society or a different culture. That kind of contextualized knowledge, I think, is uniquely human and will remain so. And so it's about balancing the effort between that human machine teaming in order to get the most useful benefits of the tools.
That's an important distinction. And also, leaders need to avoid over relying on AI without understanding its limitations, correct? Because such as biases in data or lack of contextual awareness, like you just mentioned, transparency in how AI is used and ensuring that it complements rather than overrides human judgment is critical.
I think that that's correct. Again, it's not intended to be, at least in my opinion, sort of a replacement tool, but it's something that could take maybe a good strategy and make it a better strategy. It's a tool that can help us identify when we have a good idea or we've built, let's say, a business plan or a marketing strategy or some financial goals that we've put down. It can help us identify gaps in our thinking. It can help us identify patterns. It can help us connect some of those different narratives together in a way that we may have not been able to formulate. So these are all wonderful advancements that we ought to be able to take advantage of. The key is not to over rely on these tools to the point where it stifles our own creativity and puts us in a position where we become dependent. I mean, it's interesting. If you think about it, I've talked to colleagues where they now are using their AI tools to be able to respond to almost every email that they get, and it's to the point now where they are sitting down at their computers and they say, like, geez, I don't even remember, like, I don't even want to start writing an email. I have to ask my AI tool to do that for me first. And I know that sounds maybe sort of like a trivial example, but I think it's one small way to describe that, yes, you still want to be able to retain some of these core skill sets. You don't want to outsource all of our writing and creativity immediately out to these tools, because you can see quickly our own skills would begin to atrophy.
Let's first talk about strategic foresight. And you mentioned that it's an academic discipline that seeks to foster anticipatory thinking to aid decision making. And these practitioners are well versed in the process of identifying these weak or an emerging signals, as well as sources of disruption and or societal change agents. So unpack that a little bit more and kind of broaden that definition and distinction of really what strategic foresight is and how it can help leaders.
Sure. Well, let's demystify it a little bit, because we threw around a lot of sort of, a lot of terms that are very specific to the discipline. Strategic foresight, in simple terms, really just means developing an anticipatory way of thinking in order to make better decisions. That's really what it is in a nutshell. So it's taking a methodology that's been developed over the last 60, 70 years that started in the defense sector, started actually after World War II, where lots of decision makers and policymakers were trying to understand how they were going to navigate the new world of US and Soviet competition that was emerging in the beginning of the Cold War. And what it really evolved into is a way of trying to be proactive and thinking through how various factors might affect a particular situation so that they wouldn't be surprised. So it's thinking about building different scenarios. And it's not only scenarios, but scenarios are a popular way of depicting a strategic foresight based analysis, because it's basically a story. A scenario is a story, it's a narrative that people can understand, and it's a way of depicting something that maybe doesn't exist yet. That's a real important factor behind using a scenario based analysis. But in the business and in corporate world, strategic foresight, I think, is a real game changer, because what it allows executives to do, what it allows decision makers to do, is maybe be a little bit more flexible in their thinking, maybe take away some of the limitations, even some of the financial constraints that they might have, and say, look, in a perfect world, how could I get to the optimal outcome that I want to achieve for my organization or my company? And then let's map out ways to get there. If we can't get there this way, or if one of the scenarios shows that there's significant disruptions or roadblocks, what do we need to do to get around them? How could we model perhaps different outcomes? How could we sort of, game our way through these obstacles so that we can achieve what we want? But to be honest, a lot of it is actually identifying what those aspirational futures for the organization ought to be. And in many cases, in my experience, so many organizations, both in and outside of government, haven't done that task. They actually haven't figured out exactly where it is they want to go. And I think that's also a reflection of the leaders at the top of those organizations as much as it is the workforce.
And all too often, I see organizations tend to coalesce around one particular vision of the future, which can expose major vulnerabilities in their strategic planning, but it also has some weaknesses. And that's why I love what you say is that why future studies or this strategic foresight is not about predicting the future. It's about providing multiple images of what's possible, if not probable, to test their intellectual arsenal for strategic adaptation.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's essentially what we're trying to do is nobody is ever going to be able to predict the future. I don't care how accurate predictive analytics get. When we're talking about human behavior, we're talking about decisions based on human behavior, we're never going to be able to predict these kinds of outcomes. But what we can do is we can find a way to get towards better decision making, more informed decision making, so that when we present decision makers with several options, they will have a little bit more certainty because we've said, look, we're not going to take out the disruptions. We're not going to mitigate the uncertainty. We're going to bake that into the analysis. And we're going to put that on the table so that we can show our work. These aren't just sort of made up storylines, right? And this is maybe a point to address this. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people out there today that are sort of peddling just stories without any baseline. And why I mentioned earlier that this is an academic discipline, and it's important that we understand that we're using real methodologies that have been tested, real theories that have been used in business and government, so that we're actually arriving at the results that we want. That's a really important distinction to make. Unfortunately, after the pandemic, there's been an explosion of these kinds of analyses. Everybody wants to future proof everything. On the one hand, that's a good thing because now we're raising awareness. On the other hand, we also want to make sure that we're using the real tools and methods, that have been proven to work over the years and have been tested at universities and in the real world.
And I know that technology can be used really to enhance this process. Speak to me a little bit about AI and how that can benefit strategic foresight.
Well, I think the biggest takeaway, number one, is when I look at, let's say, the next 10 years or next 15 years, I think management consulting is going to be fundamentally transformed. I mean, the amount of people that you need, the amount of human beings that you need on a particular project, and obviously it's based on the size and scope of the project, but the capacity now that I require with me, a very small team of experts allows me to punch way above my weight using AI based tools. I don't think the workforce and the market has quite absorbed that reality yet, and I think that you're going to start seeing some significant reductions over this period, because or you're going to see firms that are going to be breakout firms that are able to successfully leverage this human machine teaming construct, and they're going to just beat out the competition, and they're going to create a new market with better products and more efficient ways of doing business. That's a real concrete example that I can see, and this from where I sit, in the Washington D.C. area. This is a huge industry. This is a huge global industry. I think how we can navigate the future of management consulting with human machine teaming is really a game changer.
Can agree with you more again with that statement because AI really accelerates that by analyzing the vast sets of data, identifying patterns and trends so much quicker than what you can without using it. But I also like what it does. What I think it also does is it democratizes strategic foresight, making it accessible to even smaller organizations. They may lack these extensive resources.
It absolutely does. And one of the articles that I've written with some colleagues, we actually look at contingency planning for strategic foresight or scenario development. So, it's one thing to look at scenarios over a 20-year time horizon or a 15-year time horizon. And, maybe you have a big production team or an analytic team. Let's say you're, a really big company or a big organization that can do that. But what about, a smaller or medium-sized business that needs to get results immediately? What if your time horizon is 7 or 8 days? Then what do you do? And that's where Gen AI based tools can really make a difference, because you're able to cut through some of the beginning steps of the process, like the data analysis, data gathering, trend analysis, sort of going through all of the numbers, sifting through the information. You're able to really reduce the time frame that's required to get all of that done. And then you're able to use even a small team to great effect towards looking at contingency scenario planning, let's say for something that you need tomorrow or the next day. We saw that done during the pandemic when it was a lot of people were concerned about climate related issues or health related issues, where they needed to make decisions quickly about, let's say, reimagining supply chains, reimagining sourcing for their businesses. This is where the contingency scenario planning really comes in handy.
So, from data collection to strategy generation, AI can really enhance this planning process. Let's take a deeper dive into scenario planning. Walk us through how generative AI improves each stage of it, which are really that scenario creation, the narrative exploration, and then the strategy generation.
The real transformation in scenario development with AI based tools is that now you're able to have a partner in the entire process that not only can check your work, make your work better, but for example, in the beginning stages of scenario development, where I might needed to have spent maybe even a full day gathering the information, creating an analysis, maybe gathering inputs from my colleagues that are on the team working that same problem. I could maybe get that same amount of work that would take me maybe a full work day to do in maybe a half an hour, right? Something like that. So what does that do? That time frame now is dramatically reduced. But what it also can help me do right up front is I may actually be looking at the problem from a biased way, from a biased perspective, or maybe predisposed based on what my own beliefs are, or what my company's mission is, or where we think we are positioned in the marketplace. And this is where a Gen AI based tool can help us say, wait a minute, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? It's going to check the analysis, it's going to identify maybe an anomaly in the patterns we've established that we hadn't thought about. And so this is where it becomes truly transformational and where we need to become more familiar with using these kinds of tools so that we can harness their true value. And again, it's that constant balance that's the theme of our discussion today, which is that not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and making sure that you're still retaining that human capacity for creativity and innovation while partnering and enhancing that analysis via the AI based tools.
But I love how it really amplifies each stage of that process. Like you mentioned, scenario creation, AI can aggregate and analyze the data to identify key uncertainties and trends, which does it in far faster time frames than what you could do without that. The narrative exploration generates rich, detailed scenario narratives that make complex ideas relatable and accessible to diverse stakeholders, which I find always is an issue in organizations where it's just not connecting with a diverse group of stakeholders and not providing that compelling narrative arc, which AI, especially generative AI, is so adept at doing. And then the final part is that strategy generation where it can propose these actionable strategies for each scenario. And teammates then can collaborate and refine those and align those with organizational goals, but really amplifies each step and shortens that cycle so that you can get to the final stage far quicker and really with better insights and information as a result.
Absolutely. And particularly with respect to the narrative piece, I think that's really a place where your Gen AI based tools can help you out considerably. You're able to take the data that you've gathered in the first steps of the scenario development process and, in some cases, in a matter of seconds or minutes, get a very well established narrative, a story, if you will, to actually describe a particular scenario, to describe a new world, to describe a situation in a compelling way that you could then deliver as decision quality information to the audience that you're trying to reach. So it truly is a transformative tool. And what's exciting about it to me, Charles, is that we're still very much in the beginning stages of experimenting with these tools and understanding their implications. And that's why I'll go back to what I said earlier, which is that we have to really be diligent in developing what the future workforce requirements are going to be, depending on our sector. And we have to make sure that we are accounting for a lot of these changes because, as I said, I think there is going to be a rude awakening and we're going to see some major shifts in market forces as a result of this. And, those organizations that are able to adapt and absorb these lessons and implement them and then get out there and do it are going to be the ones that will stay ahead of the competition.
Agreed. And a good story can be the difference between understanding and confusion. Why are narratives so important? And maybe provide an example of kind of what you've seen from your work on how that really can make an impact and a difference in this area.
Well, I think the compelling piece of a narrative is that when you're trying to describe something that's going to happen in the future, if you're trying to tell a CEO or some government official or some other decision maker about something that doesn't quite exist yet, you're trying to get them to take a leap of faith and understand, hey, this is why we need to invest here now. This is why I need to move this plant from this country to that country. This is why we need to think differently about investing in the workforce here. Whatever the issue is, they can't see it yet. They can't understand exactly why it is you would like that to happen. And so, giving that creative narrative, that compelling narrative that is able to tell them, well, imagine a world where X, Y, and Z are happening. Wouldn't it be better to make this decision understanding that these are the parameters of that world? And I think it just makes it all that much more real for them. And at the end of the day, they may feel better. And in many cases, they do feel better because I've seen this happen about making a difficult decision, right? Because these are all difficult decisions when they get to that point. Rather than sort of just taking a blind leap of faith, they can say, all right, I can see the work, I can see the analysis. But more importantly, you've told this is a really important piece that I'd like to mention. Decision makers don't care in many cases about the method. They don't care how you got there. They just want to know what is the advice you're going to give them. Many in the foresight field or strategic foresight practitioners get enamored with the methodology to the detriment of the final analysis. I always say that when we talk about strategic foresight, the operative word is strategic. It's a tool to build strategy. And if you're not using it to build strategy, then you're frankly wasting a lot of people's time.
That's an important distinction to make too, because you're right. People get lost in the details and the process, and really they want the results. And if you can provide a compelling narrative, because I think storytelling is an understated, underutilized leadership quality, but all the great leaders are great storytellers. You can simplify these complex ideas, make them accessible for stakeholders at different levels of expertise, and provide that common language that unites them around these shared goals.
Well, that's exactly right. And, we used storytelling when I was still serving in the United States Air Force, I think to great effect, to try to create a better awareness of what are the implications to the Department of Defense from the pandemic and for maybe from future pandemics and from future bio based tools, things like synthetic biology moving forward. What kinds of problems and challenges would those developments create? And what would future decision makers find in front of them? And I think using storytelling, using a narrative building to do that was one important tool. Just number one, to raise awareness, just to get people to start paying attention differently than they were. So I completely agree with the importance of building that narrative, and then why today, in tandem with Gen AI based tools, you can really take narrative building to the next level.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.